Let me ask you something, and don't answer it too quickly, because the truth you rush past is usually the one that owns you the most. Why is it that a person can sit in the dark at night, feel completely certain about change, almost convinced that tomorrow will be different, that this time they've had enough, that this time they'll finally take control, and yet, when morning comes, nothing changes except the excuses get quieter and more familiar? Why does that promise, made in such a serious, almost sacred moment, collapse so easily under something as small as a thought, a feeling, or just a few seconds of boredom? You see, people like to say it's a lack of discipline. They throw that word around like it explains everything, like it's some missing ingredient you can just pick up if you try hard enough. But if that were true, then effort alone would have fixed it already, wouldn't it? You've tried before, haven't you? You've said, "This is the last time," maybe more times than you can count. Maybe so many times that the words themselves have started to feel empty, like a routine your mind goes through without even believing it anymore. And that's where it gets uncomfortable. Because now, it's not just about the habit, it's about the quiet realization that you might not trust yourself the way you thought you did. And that's the part people avoid talking about, because it's easier to blame distraction, or stress, or even the world around you, than to sit with the idea that something inside you keeps choosing the same path, even when you already know where it leads. Think about it. How many times has it played out the same way, almost like a script you didn't consciously write, but somehow keep performing anyway? It starts small, almost harmless, just a little scroll, just checking something for a minute, just letting your mind wander because you tell yourself you deserve a break. And nothing about that moment feels dangerous. Nothing about it feels like the beginning of a problem. But then 1 minute turns into 10, 10 turns into an hour, and somewhere in between, your attention slips, your awareness softens, and you're no longer choosing, you're just following. Following what feels easy, what feels familiar, what gives you that quick hit of relief without asking anything from you in return. And in that moment, it doesn't feel like losing. It feels like comfort, like something you can control, like something that belongs to you. But what you don't see, at least not right away, is how that comfort quietly rewires you, how it teaches your mind to avoid effort, to escape discomfort, to reach for the nearest source of stimulation every time things slow down or feel uncertain. And the next time an urge shows up, it's not just an isolated moment anymore. It's backed by all those small decisions you've been making throughout the day. Decisions that seemed insignificant on their own, but together form a pattern. And patterns are powerful. They don't ask for permission. They don't wait for you to be ready. They just run. So when you find yourself giving in again, it feels confusing, almost frustrating, because part of you genuinely wanted to do better. Part of you believed that this time would be different. But another part of you, the part shaped by repetition, by habit, by everything you've been feeding your attention, was already moving in a different direction long before that moment even arrived. And that's where the real question begins. Not the surface level one about why you failed this time, but the deeper one about what you've been practicing without realizing it. Because whether you notice it or not, your mind is always learning, always adapting, always becoming more efficient at whatever you repeatedly do. If you constantly reach for distraction, it learns to crave it. If you constantly avoid discomfort, it learns to fear it. And if you constantly give in at the first sign of resistance, it learns that resistance isn't something to push through, it's something to escape from. So when people say, just be stronger, they're skipping over the reality that strength isn't something you switch on in a single moment. It's something built quietly, often invisibly, through the choices you make when nothing feels urgent, when no one is watching, when it would be easier to drift than to stay present. And here's the part that stings a little. Most of the time, the battle isn't lost when the urge appears. It's lost long before that, in the small, almost forgettable moments where you train yourself to look away from effort, to lean into comfort, to choose what feels good now over what actually moves you forward. It's in the habit of checking your phone without thinking, in the way you fill every silence with noise, in how quickly you escape boredom instead of sitting with it. And none of these things feel like a big deal on their own, but together, they shape the way you respond when it matters. So when you ask yourself why you keep ending up in the same place, it's not because you're broken, and it's not because you don't care enough. It's because your mind has been quietly trained to follow a certain path. And until you see that clearly, until you really understand how those small, repeated choices build into something much bigger, you'll keep fighting the same battle from the same position, expecting a different outcome without changing the conditions that lead you there. And that's a hard thing to accept, because it means the problem isn't just the moment you're trying to fix. It's the pattern you've been living in, the one that feels normal because you've been in it for so long. The one that convinces you that this is just how things are, that this is just who you are, even though deep down, there's a part of you that knows it doesn't have to stay this way. There was a man, not someone extraordinary, not someone you would notice in a crowd, just the kind of person who blends into the rhythm of everyday life, the kind who wakes up when the alarm rings, sometimes hits snooze once or twice, then reaches for his phone before his eyes are even fully open. Not because he needs to, but because it has become the first reflex his body remembers before his mind even gets a chance to speak. And within seconds, he is already somewhere else, scrolling through fragments of other people's lives, short clips, flashes of faces, bodies, voices, all stitched together in a stream that never really ends. And he tells himself it's just a few minutes, just a way to wake up. But those minutes stretch quietly, unnoticed, until the morning feels rushed and slightly off balance, like he's already late for something he can't quite name. He moves through his day the way many people do, carrying small pieces of distraction with him, checking his phone in between tasks, during meals, even in moments where nothing is actually required of him, as if silence itself has become something uncomfortable, something that needs to be filled before it grows too loud. And every time he scrolls, there's always something waiting, something designed to catch his attention just long enough to keep him there. Not too obvious, not too aggressive, just enough to pull him in a little deeper each time. He doesn't think much of it at first, because nothing seems broken. His life continues, his responsibilities get handled, conversations happen, days pass, and on the surface, everything looks normal. But underneath that normalcy, something subtle begins to shift. His attention becomes shorter, his patience thinner, and the moments where he can sit still without reaching for stimulation start to disappear without him even realizing it. Then there are the nights, the quiet hours when the day slows down and there are no more tasks left to hide behind, no more obligations to distract him, just him and his thoughts. And that's when the familiar pattern begins to unfold. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in a way that feels almost automatic, like a path he has walked so many times that his feet already know where to go without asking for permission. He lies there, maybe holding his phone, maybe telling himself he should sleep, that tomorrow matters, that he needs to wake up early. But there's always that small voice, the one that suggests something easy, something quick, something that promises a moment of escape from the dullness, or the restlessness, or whatever it is he doesn't want to sit with. And he hesitates for a second, just a second, long enough to recognize the choice in front of him, but not long enough to stop himself. And then he gives in, not because he's decided to fail, but because at that moment, it feels easier than resisting. Afterward, there's no dramatic collapse, no loud regret, just a quiet heaviness, a sense that something slipped again, something he meant to hold on to. And he tells himself the same thing he's told himself before, that it was the last time, that tomorrow will be different, that he just needs to be more careful, more aware, more disciplined. And in that moment, he almost believes it, because the intention feels real, the desire to change feels honest. But intention alone doesn't rewrite patterns. It doesn't undo the hours of conditioning that came before that moment. The next day, the cycle continues. Not exactly the same, but close enough that the differences don't matter. The phone is still there. The scrolling still happens. The small choices still lean toward comfort instead of effort. And slowly, almost invisibly, he starts to feel a gap between who he thinks he should be and who he actually is. And that gap doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. It just sits there quietly, growing a little wider each time he repeats the same behavior. He begins to notice small things, like how hard it is to focus on a single task without his mind drifting, how often he feels restless even when there's nothing wrong, how easily his energy fades when something requires sustained effort. And he doesn't immediately connect these things to his habits because they seem unrelated, like separate issues scattered across his day. But in reality, they all trace back to the same source, the constant pull toward easy stimulation, the repeated choice to avoid discomfort, the quiet training of his mind to expect reward without effort. In social settings, he's present but not fully, part of his attention always ready to slip away, to check something, to scroll, to fill any gap that might open up. And even when he's alone, he's rarely just with himself. There's always something playing, something moving, something feeding his senses. And over time, the idea of sitting in silence, of doing nothing, of simply being without distraction, starts to feel almost unbearable, like something is missing, even though what's actually missing is the ability to be still. The pattern tightens not because he chooses it consciously, but because it becomes familiar, and familiarity has a way of disguising itself as comfort, even when it's slowly taking something from you. And by the time he starts to question it, the habit is already deeply rooted, woven into the structure of his day, reinforced by every small decision that seemed insignificant at the time. He doesn't see himself as addicted, not in the way people usually define it, because his life hasn't fallen apart. He's still functioning, still moving forward in certain areas, but there's a quiet awareness that something isn't quite right, that his energy isn't where it should be, that his focus slips too easily, that his sense of control isn't as strong as he wants it to be, and that awareness comes and goes, sometimes clear, sometimes buried under the noise of daily life, but it never fully disappears. And so he continues, not because he's given up, but because he hasn't yet stepped far enough back to see the full picture, to recognize how all these small, seemingly harmless behaviors connect, how they build on each other, how they shape the way he responds when it matters most. And until that moment of clarity arrives, he remains inside the pattern, moving through it, repeating it, wondering why change feels so close at night and so far away in the morning, not realizing that the answer isn't hidden in a single decision, but in the countless small ones that come before it. And then, one evening, not dramatic, not cinematic, just an ordinary evening that felt like all the others, something shifted, not outside of him, but in the way he finally looked at what had been happening all along. Because for the first time, he stopped asking, "Why can't I control myself?" and started asking a quieter, more uncomfortable question. What has been controlling me before I even try? And that question didn't come with relief. It came with a kind of stillness that made everything harder to ignore. Because once you begin to see patterns clearly, they stop feeling random. They start feeling structured, almost engineered, and that realization changes the weight of everything. He began to notice that his urges didn't just appear out of nowhere like sudden storms. They had a rhythm, a build-up, a sequence that repeated itself so consistently it was almost predictable. And the more he paid attention, the more he saw that those moments he used to call weakness were actually the final step of something that had already been unfolding for hours, sometimes the entire day, long before he even recognized it. It started with the small things, the ones he used to dismiss because they didn't feel important enough to question, like how often his hand reached for his phone without any clear reason, not out of necessity, but out of habit, like a reflex that had been trained through repetition. And every time he gave in to that reflex, he wasn't just passing time, he was reinforcing a pathway in his mind, teaching it that boredom should be avoided, that silence should be filled, that the quickest way to feel something, anything, was always just a swipe away. And what he hadn't realized before was that this constant exposure to fast, easy stimulation was quietly lowering his tolerance for stillness, making anything that required patience feel heavier than it actually was. So when an urge finally arrived, it didn't have to fight against a stable mind. It arrived in a mind that had already been softened, already been conditioned to seek the easiest escape. He saw it clearly one night, almost like watching himself from a distance, how the sequence unfolded with precision. He had spent the evening scrolling, not deeply engaged, just drifting from one piece of content to another. Nothing meaningful, nothing lasting, just enough to keep his brain occupied without asking anything from him. And when he finally put the phone down, the silence that followed didn't feel calm. It felt empty, almost uncomfortable, like something was missing. And that discomfort was the doorway, the exact moment where his mind, now accustomed to constant stimulation, began searching for the next hit, not because he consciously wanted it, but because it had been trained to expect it. That's when the urge appeared, not as a random thought, but as a continuation of everything that came before it. And for the first time, he didn't see it as an isolated enemy. He saw it as a result, a predictable outcome of the environment he had been living in all day. And that realization didn't make the urge disappear, but it stripped away the illusion that it was something mysterious or uncontrollable, because now he could trace it back, step by step, to the small decisions that led him there. And that's when the truth settled in, not loudly, but with a quiet certainty that was hard to ignore. He hadn't been losing in the moment of temptation. He had been losing in the hours before it, in the way he spent his time, in the things he allowed into his mind, in how often he chose comfort over awareness without even noticing it. And once he saw that, the entire problem shifted shape. Because now it wasn't about fighting harder in a single moment. It was about understanding the system that made that moment almost inevitable. He began to question things he had never questioned before, like why his environment was filled with triggers he didn't actively choose but still consumed, why his digital space, the place he spent so much time in, was designed in a way that constantly nudged him toward distraction, toward stimulation, toward anything that kept him engaged without requiring effort. And he realized that he had been treating this environment as neutral, as something he could navigate without consequence, when in reality it had been shaping him all along, influencing his thoughts, his attention, even his impulses in ways that felt personal but were actually patterned. The twist wasn't that he lacked control, it was that his control had been slowly eroded by repetition, by exposure, by a system that rewarded immediacy and punished patience. And once he understood that, something inside him shifted, not into motivation, not into sudden strength, but into clarity. And clarity is quieter than motivation, but far more stable, because it doesn't rely on emotion. It relies on seeing things as they are. He stopped seeing himself as someone who needed to become stronger overnight, and started seeing himself as someone who needed to change the conditions that kept producing the same outcome. And that meant looking at his habits differently, not as isolated actions, but as parts of a larger pattern that either supported him or worked against him. He noticed how even the content he consumed casually had an effect, how certain images, certain themes, certain suggestions lingered in his mind longer than he realized, shaping the direction of his thoughts later on. And it became clear that his mind wasn't just reacting to what was in front of him in the moment. It was carrying traces of everything he had absorbed throughout the day. And those traces added up. They built momentum. They influenced what felt natural and what felt difficult. The more he observed, the more he understood that what he had been calling self-control was actually the surface of something much deeper. Because control isn't just about resisting what's in front of you. It's about recognizing what you've been feeding yourself long before that moment arrives. And that realization removed the illusion of randomness completely, because now every urge, every slip, every repeated behavior could be traced back to something specific, something concrete, something that could be changed if he was willing to adjust the way he lived, not just the way he reacted. And in that understanding, there was no immediate victory, no sudden transformation. But there was something more important, a shift in perspective that made the problem feel less like a personal failure and more like a pattern that could be studied, understood, and eventually reshaped. And that shift, quiet as it was, marked the point where the story stopped being about losing control in isolated moments and started becoming about reclaiming it in the spaces that came before. So he didn't rush anymore. That was the first thing that changed. Not in a way people would notice from the outside, but in the way he began to move through his own day. Because once he understood that the real battle wasn't in one loud moment, but in a series of quiet ones, he stopped trying to win all at once and started paying attention to the spaces in between. The small decisions that used to pass unnoticed, the moments where his mind would reach for something out of habit and he would simply pause, not dramatically, not as an act of force, but as a kind of interruption, like gently placing a hand on a wheel that had been spinning on its own for too long. At first it felt unnatural, almost uncomfortable, like trying to walk differently after years of moving the same way. His body still leaned toward the familiar patterns. His fingers still drifted toward the phone. His thoughts still searched for the easiest way to escape whatever quiet discomfort showed up. But now there was a thin layer of awareness between the impulse and the action. And that layer, as small as it seemed, began to create space. He didn't fill that space immediately. He let it sit there, even when it felt empty, even when it made him restless. Because he was starting to understand something most people never sit long enough to realize. That boredom isn't an enemy, it's a signal, a kind of threshold that separates a distracted mind from a present one. And if you keep running from it, you never cross into anything deeper. So he let himself feel it, the slow, dragging seconds where nothing was happening. No stimulation, no quick reward, just the raw presence of being alone with his own thoughts. And at first, Those thoughts weren't kind. They were scattered, impatient, sometimes even uncomfortable, bringing up things he had been avoiding, questions he didn't have answers to, emotions he didn't know how to process. And for a while, he considered going back, returning to the noise that could cover all of it up in an instant. But something held him there. Not strength exactly, more like curiosity, a quiet willingness to see what would happen if he didn't escape this time. He began to notice how his mind worked when it wasn't constantly fed, how it jumped from one idea to another, how it tried to create its own stimulation when none was provided. And instead of shutting it down, he observed it, almost like watching a restless animal pacing in a cage, not judging it, not forcing it to be still, just paying attention. And slowly, that restlessness started to lose its edge. Not completely, but enough that he could sit with it a little longer each time. He also changed the way he used his body, not in pursuit of some ideal image or external validation, but as a way to ground himself in something real, something that required effort, something that couldn't be skipped or fast-forwarded. And when he pushed himself physically, when his muscles felt heavy and his breath deepened, he noticed that his mind quieted in a different way, not because he suppressed it, but because it had somewhere else to direct its energy, somewhere that demanded presence instead of distraction. The urges didn't disappear, they still came, sometimes at the same times, sometimes unexpectedly, but now they felt different, less like commands and more like waves, rising, peaking, and eventually falling if he didn't grab onto them. And that was new for him, because before, an urge felt like something that had to be acted on, something urgent and immediate. But now he could see its full shape, its beginning, its middle, and its end. And once you see that, once you experience that it doesn't last forever, it loses some of its power. There were moments where he still slipped, moments where the old patterns pulled him back in, and he didn't pretend those moments didn't happen. He didn't cover them with excuses or harsh self-judgment. He looked at them closely, not to punish himself, but to understand what led to them, what he had missed, what he could adjust. And that shift in response made a difference, because instead of turning a mistake into a reason to give up, he turned it into information, something that helped him see the pattern more clearly. Over time, the changes weren't loud. They didn't announce themselves, but they showed up in small, steady ways, in how long he could focus without drifting, in how comfortable he became with silence, in how less urgent his impulses felt, and perhaps most importantly, in the way he began to trust himself again. Not because he was perfect, but because he was present, because he was paying attention, because he was no longer moving through his habits unconsciously. There was a kind of quiet respect that started to build, not the kind that comes from achievement or recognition, but the kind that comes from knowing you can sit with yourself without needing to escape, that you can face discomfort without immediately reaching for relief, that you can let a moment pass without turning it into something else. And in that space, something deeper began to form, something that didn't rely on motivation or external pressure, something more stable, more grounded, a sense that control isn't about force, it's about alignment, about living in a way where your actions don't constantly pull you away from the person you're trying to become. The pace of his life slowed, not externally but internally. His reactions became less automatic, his choices more deliberate. And even though nothing about his environment had drastically changed, his relationship to it had. And that made all the difference, because now he wasn't just reacting to what was around him, he was interacting with it consciously, choosing what to engage with and what to let pass. The noise didn't disappear, the world didn't suddenly become quiet, but he did, in a way that allowed him to move through that noise without being consumed by it. And that quiet wasn't empty, it was full of awareness, full of intention, full of a kind of presence that had been missing for a long time. And in that presence, he found something he hadn't felt in a while. Not excitement, not even happiness in the usual sense, but a steady, grounded sense of being okay where he was, of not needing to constantly reach for something else. And that, more than anything, marked the real change. Not the absence of struggle, but the ability to stay with himself through it without running away. And if you stay with this long enough, if you really sit with everything that has unfolded, not just the obvious moments but the quiet ones in between, you begin to see that the story was never about a single habit, never about one mistake repeated too many times. It was about a way of living that slowly pulled a person away from himself without making a sound. And the hardest part is not that it happens. The hardest part is that it feels normal while it's happening. It feels like nothing is wrong, because nothing breaks all at once. There's no clear line where everything collapses, just a gradual shift where you become slightly less present, slightly less focused, slightly less connected to your own intentions, until one day you notice that the person you thought you were becoming is always just a little out of reach. And that realization, if you allow it to land without rushing past it, carries a kind of weight that doesn't need to be exaggerated, because it's already real enough on its own. It forces you to look at yourself not in a harsh way, not with blame, but with honesty, the kind that doesn't hide behind explanations or temporary motivation, the kind that asks simple questions and waits for real answers, like, what do you actually do with your time when no one is watching? What do you feed your mind when you're left alone with it? What patterns are you reinforcing every single day without even noticing? And more importantly, are those patterns building something you respect or something you quietly avoid thinking about? Because in the end, it's not the big decisions that define you. It's the small ones, repeated so often they become invisible. The ones that don't feel important in the moment, but shape everything over time. And once you see that clearly, once you stop looking for a dramatic turning point and start paying attention to the ordinary moments, the entire process of change becomes less about force and more about awareness. The man in this story didn't become someone else overnight. He didn't wake up one day completely free from struggle. And that's important, because the idea of sudden transformation is one of the reasons people stay stuck. They wait for a moment where everything feels different, where change becomes easy, where the effort disappears. But that moment rarely comes. And when it doesn't, they assume something is wrong, when in reality, nothing is wrong. This is just what real change looks like. Slow, quiet, sometimes uncomfortable, often unnoticed by others, but deeply felt by the person living through it. He still had days where his mind wandered, days where old habits tried to pull him back. But the difference now was that he saw them coming. He recognized the patterns before they fully took over. And that gave him a choice, not a perfect one, not an easy one, but a real one. And over time, those choices added up, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady, consistent shift that moved him closer to the kind of person he actually wanted to be. And that's where the real lesson settles in, not as a rule, not as something you have to memorize, but as something you begin to understand through experience. That control is not about suppressing yourself or fighting every impulse like it's an enemy. It's about creating a life where those impulses no longer dominate your direction, where your environment, your habits, your attention all work together instead of against you. And that kind of alignment doesn't come from one decision. It comes from many small ones made with awareness. So if you're listening to this, not casually, but with that quiet recognition that something here feels familiar, then don't rush to change everything at once. Don't turn this into another promise you make at night and forget in the morning. Start with something smaller, something real, something you can actually see and adjust. Maybe it's how you spend the first hour of your day. Maybe it's what you choose to look at when your mind is idle. Maybe it's how you respond the next time you feel that familiar pull, not by fighting it aggressively, but by noticing it, by giving it space without immediately obeying it, and seeing what happens when you don't follow the same script. Because the truth is, you don't need to become a completely different person to change your direction. You just need to stop repeating the same unconscious patterns that keep leading you back to the same place. And that starts with awareness, with honesty, with a willingness to look at your life without filters, and ask yourself whether the way you're living is actually aligned with who you want to become. And maybe that question doesn't have a perfect answer right now. Maybe it feels uncertain. Maybe it even feels uncomfortable. But that's not a bad place to be. That's where real change begins. Not in certainty, but in the willingness to stay present long enough to see things clearly. So let me leave you with this. Not as advice, not as a command, but as something to carry with you after this moment passes, when everything gets quiet again, and it's just you and your thoughts. Who are you when no one is guiding you? When there's no video playing, no voice reminding you what to do? Just your habits, your attention, your choices unfolding in real time. Are they leading you somewhere you respect, or somewhere you've simply gotten used to? And if the answer isn't what you want it to be, then maybe that's not something to avoid. Maybe that's exactly where you begin. And if this way of looking at things speaks to you, not loudly, but in that quiet, steady way that stays in the back of your mind, then you don't have to do anything dramatic. Just stay a little longer, keep listening, keep observing, Keep walking through these thoughts one step at a time. Because sometimes the most meaningful changes don't come from being pushed. They come from choosing to stay, to pay attention, and to move forward, slowly but honestly, in a direction that finally feels like your own.